So good morning, everyone. I'm Murray Ross. I direct the Institute for Health Policy at Kaiser Permanente, and I once again have the challenge of trying to bring everybody back from the coffee break. Caffeinated and energized, and we hope to keep you that way. But for the moment, if we can get settled here. Margaret, you'll be bringing stragglers in from outside, and I would also welcome anybody who's in the overflow room. That we do have space in here if you want to give up those palatial tables and uncomfortable desk chairs. There's places to sit here. So this is the session on policy and political outlook for federal health care legislation, and I want to thank Margaret, as always, for engaging me, and Paul for inviting me. I don't know if this is year 18, 19, or 20 that I've been affiliated with this conference, but it's always a pleasure to be here. I was struck by the Annals article that Bill Hoagland was waving with the sort of 9 issues in healthcare, because I have a talk that is sort of the top 10 things that I worry about in healthcare, and I think there's an overlap on about 8 of them. So that's 45 years of progress. But part of the challenge here is there's the things you don't know how to fix. There's the things you know how to fix, but you don't have the money or the political will to fix them. And then there's the political cycle that makes everything a challenge to get done with short bursts of energy. So in summer Olympic years, such as this one, we get together here in February to speculate about the health policy and issues facing the presidential candidates and Congress. It's either a lame duck year or it's a legacy year, and not a lot necessarily gets done. Then we move past the post-election, and that's sort of the mandate year for an incoming president, and this time we know it will be a new one. A lot of issues facing that person. That'll be our conversation next February, but real work gets done in those mandate years. The Balanced Budget Act of 1997 was one. The Affordable Care Act was another, although it stretched into 2010. In the next set of even years, we start worrying about the midterms and how whatever the president got done in his mandate year be addressed following the new Congress. And then we have one more action year, and in this case that was 2015, and it's another get stuff done year. There's pivots and legacies, and we had the Medicare Modernization Act that brought us Medicare Part D. Last year we had MACRA. This panel is eminently qualified to address both what goes on in these cycles and what's facing us immediately and what's going to be a little bit longer term. You can read their biographies in depth in their materials, but I can assure you they have been everywhere and done everything in health policy in Washington, from the Hill to the executive branch to the Congressional Budget Office to the Office of Management and Budget, and into the think tanks. I'm pleased to introduce for the first time here in Irvine, Jim Capretta, who's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Jim is widely published on healthcare policies with a conservative bent, I'll say. I first met Jim in 1995, and he was at the Senate Budget Committee at the time. It was my first day on the job in the budget unit at the Congressional Budget Office. I can't remember what the question I was asked was, but it was a yes or no question, and I did not know whether it was yes or no. And I was about either to play that 50-50 chance of getting it right and moving along, or getting it wrong and looking like a complete idiot for the rest of my tenure there. But Jim spotted the hesitation and immediately leapt in with the correct answer and saved me to humiliate myself another day. So 20 years later, I am still grateful, Jim. So welcome to the Forecast Conference, and we'll give you 20 minutes before I start waving paper at you. Okay, please join me in welcoming Jim Capretta.
Well, good morning. It's really a pleasure to be invited to this. This is my first time. I have been to the school here a couple of other occasions, but this is my first time at the Forecast Conference, and so I thank Paul and the organizers, Margaret, and everyone for extending this invitation to be a part of the program. It's a great conference. I really enjoyed the first panel. I have to make a confession right at the beginning, which is that 2 of my first bosses are here, actually. So Keith Fontenot, who's on the panel and will follow me, hired me for my first job in Washington, and I won't tell you how long ago it was. It's a while ago now. And so I regularly to myself blame him for my career path. And then after finishing a tour with Keith at the Office of Management and Budget as my first job, I went on to the Hill and worked for Bill Hoagland for a decade. And so this is the old thing in Washington, you never know, who you're going to end up running into again, so be nice to everybody. So they were great bosses and great, got me started on my career, and I'm grateful to them. This is my first time here, so you can't hold me, you don't know what my predictions were last year, and so you can't hold me accountable for them. But I thought I would just tell you what they were, just so you can anticipate how good this presentation is going to be. To myself, a year ago, I was musing, I think it's time for President Obama to open up Cuba to normalize relations. And I was looking at that Denver Bronco defense, and I was thinking, they're looking pretty good. And then, of course, it was easy to spot a mile away, Donald Trump. I had it right there on that piece of paper. He was going to win the New Hampshire primary along with Bernie Sanders. It was spotted a mile away. Anyway, so the conference here is about federal legislation and the outlook for federal legislation. Murray, in his brief introduction, gave you a little preview, about, in fact, we can kind of fold up this panel here pretty quickly because nothing is going to happen in 2016. Yeah. But that's only part of the story, unfortunately. There were two pieces of legislation that passed, as Murray indicated already, in the sort of first years of each of the president's two terms. The Affordable Care Act, of course, in 2009, spilling into 2010, and then the Physician Fee Adjustment Bill, MACRA, last year. And I know many of us don't actually like to read the legislation, but if you do read those pieces of legislation, I think what you'll realize is there's plenty of work there to keep everyone busy for not just 2016, but basically for the next decade. And I think what really will characterize 2016 in terms of, it's not legislation that will characterize 2016, but there's going to be massive things moving along associated with implementation and using the authorities that were passed in those two laws, which are very, very extensive. And so for your purposes, the things you're working on, the things you deal with every day, that's really where the action is, and it's driven by legislation that passed a number of years ago, and I would say only about 25% of it has been tapped so far. There's a lot more to come. Think of the area of delivery system reform and all of the authority that the administration has in that area to try to pursue various things. If you look at what they had from the Affordable Care Act in 2010, it's quite extensive. The demonstration authority, the ability to adjust parameters through the Medicare program, and by extension to everyone else, rules of the road for paying for value, this whole business of the alternative payment models and their goals for hitting those over the next few years and trying to rope the private sector into that effort through various mechanisms. The efforts through, excuse me, I keep hitting this thing, through the physician fee adjustment program that was enacted last year. If you read that, it's also extremely open-ended about how the whole physician fee pay for value process will play out over the next few years. Massive amounts of work will have to take place to make that into some kind of a rational system. So in terms of the on-the-ground reality of delivering health care to patients, hey, the train's already left the station, really. Those two pieces of legislation were massive in terms of their implications. I think all of the action in 2016 really will be centered around those two pieces of legislation and what they might imply. But then back to the charge at hand, 2017 looms on the horizon. And we'll talk, or someone will, next year, trying to make predictions about what this new president might do. But I think it's worth noting that, and start now, that what is said on the campaign trail, I know most people, all of us who tend to follow this a little closer than maybe most Americans do, have a sense that, wow, what they say on the campaign trail really has no bearing whatsoever on what happens once they get elected. There's a little bit of a sense of that maybe amongst the cynical amongst us. I actually think that's actually not true, really. I worked for President Bush in 2001, and I can tell you they took very, very seriously what was said in 2000 on the campaign trail when they got into office and said, here's what we're going to do in our first couple of years. To the point of reading old press releases from the campaign that I wouldn't have taken seriously. So what is said over the next few months in terms of policy pronouncements, believe me, I understand nothing much has been said so far, but in the coming months, if more is said, whatever it is, it will have an implication next year if that person is successful. So keep an eye on that. Moreover, the potential is there for very, very significant legislation in 2017 if the political stars line up right. And we don't know if they will, but if you just heard from Murray, if you go back in time, at the beginning of a new administration in 1981, President Reagan came into office. He passed massive new pieces of legislation, including a budget bill, using the process then known as budget reconciliation in 1981, sort of inaugurated that process. He did it again in 1985. President Bush did it in 1990. President Clinton did it in 1993 and in 1997. President Bush did it, George W. Bush did it in 2001 for a tax bill, and President Obama did it for health care in 2009/2010. So whoever is elected next year, they're going to hit the ground running. They're going to want to pass some big marker legislation in 2017, and it could affect health care in a big way, depending on who the candidate is and the political circumstances that are prevailing at the time. So I think next year, more odds are higher rather than lower that we'll see a lot of new legislation again come next year. Now, what are the three basic scenarios that kind of legislation might fall under? I think there are really three ways to characterize what might happen next year. One would be a scenario that might be called build upon the ACA. I think we know who that is. So that's under the scenario where Secretary Clinton wins the Democratic nomination and then goes on to win the general election. And we have a Republican Congress, or mainly a Republican Congress, prevailing in the legislative branch. If that scenario prevails, which I think the betting markets still consider the most likely scenario, if that scenario prevails, then you're in a build upon the ACA environment. And I think a couple of things will fall out from that. One will be that the remaining holdout states on Medicaid expansion will likely expand. That the last 19 states that have not done so during that next 4-year period, seems to me they will very likely come under immense pressure to do the expansion. Some might hold out a little longer, but I think quite a few of them will end up doing the expansion. The second thing that is likely to happen is that the Clinton administration, if it were to come to pass, would seem to me to be in a strong position to try to get a minority Republican buy-off on the ACA's basic structure. Somehow or another, they would like to see some Republicans in the Congress vote for a piece of legislation that puts a more bipartisan imprimatur on what passed in 2010, and that would be their opportunity to do it in 2017. They'd have to give a little bit to make that happen, but having won a general election, they probably could get that if they pushed and had the right legislative strategy and circumstances. So what would be in that kind of legislation? It would be to perhaps give a little bit on some of the Republican priorities on flexibility, less regulation, more options for the consumer to have flexible choices in terms of their benefits and so on. Republicans would probably demand that. In return, you might end up with more money being spent in certain benefit categories. You might have the Republicans buying off on, to some extent, the Medicaid expansion. There could be a number of things. Now, I'm not talking about the entire Republican caucus. I'm talking about 20% of it or something as part of a large effort to try to deal with budgetary and healthcare legislation in 2017, if President Clinton is indeed the winner of the election. The other scenario would be, and this is much less likely, but still possible, accelerate the move to government regulation. This is the scenario under which Senator Sanders actually wins the nomination, then wins the general election, and you still have a Republican Congress. Wouldn't that be interesting, all right? What would happen under that scenario? Who knows? However, it seems to me you're much more likely in that scenario towards standoff. I think Senator Sanders would end up operating more as a mainstream Democrat if he actually got elected, frankly. But I do think the authorities that were passed in the ACA would allow him to move much more in the direction of a government-regulated system than even the Obama administration has done so far. So you would see more of a move toward using Medicare's authority to have an all-payer rate-setting system develop over time. Now, there are a number of ways that can be done. It's too complicated to get into now, but you could see that would be the path that he would pursue to move in the direction he's made very clear he would like to move in. And then the third scenario, the other wild card, is a Republican president and a Republican Congress. I know you're all really excited about that possibility. So that would be a change in direction type scenario where you would see pretty significant movements toward a new type of approach on healthcare. Now, having put that out there, I would say that abrupt U-turns that disrupt everything all at once don't happen all that often, okay? And especially when you've got several dozens, millions of people now tied up into a new structure. The idea of it being undone overnight, I don't think that would ever happen. But if you have a Republican who campaigns on opposition to what passed in 2010 and then wins, the probability of them saying never mind is quite low too. They're going to do something, and it'll be somewhat disruptive. So what would that look like? I'm going to go ahead first and then come back. I want to tell you about two things that are going on that might give you a window into what could happen under this particular scenario. Remote as it might be, it's good to plan, right? So the Republicans, what are they doing? In the House, new Speaker Paul Ryan has commissioned 6 separate task forces. Wendell can tell you maybe how useless they're going to be, but let me just tell you what their purposes are. He set up 6 separate task forces to lay out an agenda that they would like to put before the country as part of the campaign season, frankly. I think they're going to try to do it in the spring and the early summer, have a series of white papers. Some of them may turn into actual legislative bills, sort of providing a vision to the country of what they want to do in 6 separate areas, one of which is healthcare. And they've already assigned to the task force on healthcare the key chairman on the committees that have some jurisdiction over healthcare. That would be the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady from Texas, Fred Upton, Energy and Commerce from Michigan, John Klein, can't remember where he's from, Education and Workforce. John Klein's from Pennsylvania? I forget it. I think Pennsylvania. And Tom Price, a congressman from Georgia, is chairman of the Budget Committee. So they're sort of the leads on it, but any member on the House Republican caucus who's got an interest in this is supposed to participate. They're supposed to produce a white paper over the next several months, and it would announce to the world, here's where we want to go with healthcare with some specificity. At least that's the plan at the moment. I don't think they're going to pass anything in the House this year, but if you recall, back in 2008, you might remember that then Senate Finance Committee Chairman Max Baucus did a similar exercise. He brought together members of the Democratic caucus in the Senate around a white paper that he produced and led the charge for at the blessing of the then leader of the Senate. And that white paper that he produced became very much the blueprint for legislation that they then passed in late summer 2009 as part of the effort to pass the Affordable Care Act. In fact, it became the dominant blueprint for the final piece of legislation. So this is not without precedent that if you do it right and you execute it and you work with the Congressional Budget Office, it can be a meaningful exercise. That's their intent. You got a speaker who's got the energy and enthusiasm to do it. We'll see. You know, the proof is in the pudding. So that's on the agenda at the moment. The other thing to keep an eye on, of course, is what the presidential candidates are saying. And it's amazing that I could fit all of it on one slide. So, what has Senator Cruz said so far? I'm not covering the Democratic candidates. I'll leave that to Keith and Wendell to cover if they would like. So what has Senator Cruz said so far? So far, Senator Cruz has said, really, it was only prompting at a question at one of the debates, where the questions, to be perfectly honest, are, I think, abysmal across the board. They don't ask anything that elicits any real information. But one time he got asked about health care, and he said he had a three-pronged plan. He said he would allow the purchase across state lines, he'd sever the link between employment and insurance, and he would expand HSAs. From that, what does one derive? I don't know exactly. But that's the extent of what he said so far. Senator Rubio, he's written 2 op-eds. Okay, 1,600 words. That's, he says that he's planning a 10-year transition from employer tax preference to a refundable tax credit. He wants high-risk pools and purchase across state lines to deal with the question of people with high-risk, pre-existing conditions. And he's made it very clear that he believes that both Medicare and Medicaid need reform. And he's spelled out and he's endorsed, essentially, the concept of premium support in the Medicare program. So that is a pretty significant reform plan. President Bush has probably got, Governor Bush, not likely to be President Bush. Yeah, right there. He has the most extensive plan so far that probably could be picked up by someone later in the process, but he has a refundable tax credit proposal for people that are not eligible for employer coverage. He's got an insurance regulation scheme that would replace the mandate in the insurance rules under the ACA. He'd replace the Cadillac tax with an upper limit on the tax preference for ESI. He'd expand HSAs in a number of ways, and he would do, of course, as a former governor, very significant Medicaid reform. Governor Kasich has been pretty vague about it. He's basically said so far, hey, I've done great things on delivery system reform in Ohio. I do the same nationally. That's pretty much what he said. Ben Carson has a theme around health empowerment accounts. Best as I can tell, that means basically bigger, better HSAs across the board. And then you know who. We're going to make healthcare great again. It's going to be tremendous. We're going to take care of everybody. And it's going to be work. And by the way, healthcare works incredibly well in Scotland. So that's about as much as we've gotten so far from that. I'll conclude with a little bit of a commercial. We're think tank people, Joe and I and our colleagues, but we got together with 8 of our colleagues, Joe and I, and worked together to produce what we would recommend as a broad vision for improving healthcare across the board. It includes entitlement reform as well as insurance reforms and changes for the under 65 population. It's a plan that covers a number of different areas. These are the folks who were willing to sign on to it with some cajoling from me. And it's available, some of the copies were available outside, but you can also get it off the AEI website. Let me just talk quickly about a couple of the ideas that are in there. Some of these you'll see in some of the plans that I've just talked about, but a couple of things I think are worth mentioning. One is that if you look at the way the individual mandate is played out so far, you're going to get a lot of different opinions about whether it's working or not. It remains a very unpopular part of the ACA. I don't think it's necessary to try to do what is needed to make sure people who have continuous health insurance aren't treated poorly by the insurance regulatory system. And I think we've recommended a way to try to deal with it without the individual mandate. The second area that I would highlight is significant Medicaid reform, trying to integrate Medicaid more clearly with the population that is also low income but not on Medicaid in terms of their health insurance options. We do believe a lot of Medicare reform is necessary to address the quality and value questions that are pervasive throughout the health system. And we do recommend a lot of changes in the area of health savings accounts. I mean, one of the reasons why high deductible plans are so unpopular is because people haven't been, in many of the situations, the people that are in them haven't been given an opportunity to prepare themselves for the high deductible. They're thrown into a high deductible with no ability and no discretionary wherewithal to pay that deductible out of their own savings. If we want a high deductible system, which we're moving toward anyway, we better start ramping up enrollment in HSAs for the people that are likely to be in them so that they sense, okay, this is a doable proposition for me. It's not crazy. Until we do that, I think we're going to have we're risking a very significant backlash. I think I'm done with my time, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.